Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's video, I want to provide you with another update as to what's happening in the Russian economy and to talk to you about a second consecutive night of drone attacks on Russian oil and gas facilities. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that a couple of days ago, I posted a video talking about the fact that Ukraine is now targeting Russian oil refineries, and it had two strikes recently, causing fires at those facilities and the facilities to be temporarily closed. And we've now seen a second consecutive night of these drone attacks, and 4 facilities in Russia have now been struck and are out of action, and it's estimated that that's going to cost Russia around 1 million barrels of oil production per day. So that's going to be a big hit from a financial perspective, and Ukraine is now ramping up this offensive. So in today's video, we'll talk about the most recent attacks, and we'll actually have a look at some of the drone footage, because Russian citizens are now filming this and posting it onto the Telegram video service. So we can actually see these drones flying overhead, heading towards the oil refineries themselves. We'll have a look at some of the fires that have broken out at those facilities. We'll then talk about what Ukraine is doing in terms of developing its drone technology, because similarly to Russia, Ukraine has become a wartime economy. So it's focusing a lot of its effort and energy into producing things that are helping it in the war. And a lot of technology businesses that were previously developing things like drones just for everyday use are now turning their attention to those drones becoming military weapons. And within the last 12 months, Ukraine has set up a new initiative called BRAVE1 to develop things like drone technology. So I'll have a look at what's happening with that. We'll talk about what the impact of these attacks is on the Russian economy and Russia's finances. We'll then have a look at what the impact of all of this has been on oil prices, because they're now up to their highest level for the last 4 months. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary, talking about what I think the long-term implications of this change in strategy by Ukraine is on the war in Ukraine, what impact it will have on Russia's economy, and why President Putin is unhappy about all of this because of the upcoming elections in Russia. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks, thank you for the time and effort that you've taken to do that. Really appreciate it. And if you've signed up either as a patron, a YouTube member, or a Buy Me a Coffee member, thank you for your long-term support. Really appreciate it. It helps me posting more videos and keeping the channel going. Wednesday the 13th of March saw the second consecutive night of heavy Ukrainian drone attacks against Russian oil and gas facilities. So let's now have a look at some of the footage that's been posted on Russian social media showing the drones flying overhead, loaded with explosives, heading towards the Russian oil refineries. Less than 24 hours after Ukrainian drones damaged Lukoil's refinery in Nizhny Novgorod, Ukrainian drone attacks hit refineries in the Rostov and Ryazan regions. In Ryazan, which is around 110 miles from Moscow, a drone attack caused a fire at Rosneft's refinery, which is the 7th largest refinery in the whole of Russia, and it's been reported that the refinery has now had to shut down 2 primary oil refining units. Russia's RIA state news agency said 4 Ukrainian drones attacked the Ryazan plant in the early hours of Wednesday, leading to a 175 square metre blaze. The Ryazan plant produces 6.4% of Russia's total gasoline production, 4.1% of diesel, 7.7% of its fuel oil, and 8% of aviation fuel. The Ryazan refinery processes over 340,000 barrels of oil per day, and is a major supplier of motor fuels to Russian regions around the capital of Moscow. Later on Wednesday, a second refinery in the Rostov region, which has a capacity of around 112,000 barrels per day, halted operations after another drone strike. The 3 facilities hit by Ukrainian drones in the past 2 days account for around 12% of Russia's total oil processing capacity. And this map shows the location of Russia's major oil refineries, including those that have been attacked recently. And what this shows is that so far, Ukraine has targeted 4 of Russia's oil refineries, and 3 of those have been severely damaged, and they represent around 12% of Russia's total oil production. So that is a meaningful percentage and is going to cost Russia a huge amount of income. Now, if you've been following the channel, you'll know that we've been talking about Russia moving towards becoming a wartime economy. So basically, a lot of companies in Russia have now been commandeered and told that they have to change their production facilities and what they're actually producing to produce things that can be used in the war in Ukraine. And this has actually resulted in a boost to the Russian economy because the Russian state is now sponsoring all of those companies to produce weapons and materials. And so they're now increasing their turnover and profitability. However, when you take a step back and think about what the long-term implications of that are, they're negative for the Russian economy, because if the war in Ukraine was to stop overnight, then obviously the Russian state would no longer need all of that equipment and machinery. And so those companies would find themselves in a very difficult situation because they've turned away from customer-facing products and equipment to making things that are focused on the war. But Ukraine is also following a similar pattern. Because it's in a severe defence situation, it's now encouraging a lot of its companies to change their focus away from making products to sell to consumers to making things that can be used in the war in Ukraine. And one of the big areas of focus for this has been technology. And the development of the drones that we're talking about in today's video is partly as a result of companies that were previously making things like drones for consumer use, for fun, now changing their attention and developing these drones so that they can be used by the Ukrainian military. And in order to support this initiative from a financial perspective, the Ukrainian authorities set up a program called BRAVE1 in April 2023 and allocated an initial budget of $2.7 million to that program. And 200 companies within Ukraine signed up, and some of these companies were technology startups. So these were businesses that previously would have been thinking about developing some sort of tech to sell into the global markets. However, they've now changed their focus and they're now coming up with things that can be used in defense against Russia. So the BRAVE1 initiative is basically like a Kickstarter fund for military equipment. And this has proved to be highly successful so far. And there are now multiple options in terms of unmanned vehicles that Ukraine can use in their war against Ukraine. So we've got long-range drones that can be flown over distances of up to 1,000 kilometers or around 800 miles. And these drones can be loaded with up to 50 kilograms of explosives, which is enough to take out a tank or cause some serious damage at an oil refinery. But in addition to the long-range drones, we've also got a variety of other types of drones, including very low-cost versions that can be put into a backpack and launched by hand. So they're very handy to be used by soldiers on the move. And we've also got a lot of other drones that can be used on water and land. And Ukraine has actually developed unmanned sea drones, so basically plastic boats that go into the water that can also be loaded with explosives. And as these vessels are unmanned, they don't generate a lot of heat and are therefore very difficult to pick up on radar. And it's been reported unofficially that some of these unmanned sea drones have been used to sink Russian ships worth tens of millions of dollars. And in addition to the sea and air vehicles, there are also ground drones. So basically unmanned vehicles that can be driven over the land and therefore cause a lot of damage to Russian equipment. And what we're basically seeing here is that in exactly the same way as Russia has done, the Ukrainian economy has turned its focus away from being consumer facing to facing the war in Ukraine, and now coming up with lots of new ideas and initiatives that are being funded by BRAVE1. And it's been announced that the BRAVE1 budget for 2024 has been increased from $2.7 million to $39 million. And that is a significant increase, and that's one of the reasons why we're now seeing a huge increase in the number of drone attacks from Ukraine. The Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian oil refineries is having a huge impact on Russia's revenues, because refined oil is actually a much higher value product than crude oil. So when it goes through the refinery process and is broken down into constituent parts such as gasoline, diesel, kerosene and aircraft fuel, they become much more valuable. They are higher profit and therefore provide much more revenue to the Russian economy. So the proportionate impact of an explosion at a refinery is actually much greater than it would be at a drilling facility, because crude oil is in its basic form. It's the cheapest form of oil that you can buy. But by targeting the Russian refineries, Ukraine are going for the highest value product possible. So that's going to have a massive impact on Russia's revenues. And as I mentioned right at the start of today's video, it's estimated that the attacks that have taken place over the last few days have caused a reduction of around 1 million barrels of oil per day from Russia's perspective. Now, when you think that Russian crude oil is currently trading for around $75 per barrel, that would mean a $75 million hit per day, which on an annualized basis would be around $27 billion. However, the value of refined products is much higher than that. It will be somewhere between $100 and $150 per barrel. So that would mean that the impact of the 1 million barrel per day reduction is somewhere between $100 and $150 million per day. And when you annualize those figures, you're talking somewhere between $35 and $45 billion over a 12-month period. So that is obviously a huge impact from Russia's point of view. And the problem that Russia has is that Ukraine isn't likely to stop here. It's going to keep bombarding these refineries with more drone attacks. And every time one of them gets through, it will cost Russia tens of millions of dollars of revenue per day, and on an annualized basis that is going to cost the Russian economy billions. So this is a very serious problem from Russia's point of view. And just to put that into perspective, this chart shows the monthly revenue that Russia is earning from its oil exports, and the color coding we've got here show the different types of products. So the blue section at the bottom is crude oil, which is basically the oil that's been pulled out of the ground and put onto ships, so very basic product. We've then got three different categories of refined products, which are shown in different colours of red. The darkest red at the bottom is fuel oil and slurry, the medium red is gasoline and diesel, and the light red at the top is gasoline, kerosene and naphtha. And the bars on this chart show Russia's monthly income dating back to February 2022, which is when the conflict in Ukraine started. And what you can see from this is that over the last 2 years, Russia has actually been earning more from its refined products each month than it does from its crude oil sales. So Russia's main business is the refinery of oil. It wants to refine as many products as it can before exporting them, because that increases the sales price and therefore the profitability from Russia's point of view. And also, let's not forget that it creates employment in Russia. Because it set up these massive oil refineries, millions of people are working at those refineries in Russia. So it's creating employment and income and taxes and helping the local economies. And if we have a look at the figures for February 2024, you can see that Russia's total income was around 500 million euros per day, which is around $550 million. And refined products accounted for around 50% of that income. So the impact of these strikes on the refineries is going to be massive from Russia's point of view. And one of the other things to take into account is that Russia needs to produce a large amount of crude oil every day just to keep the flow moving. And a lot of that crude oil is diverted to its refineries for processing before the final products are exported. So if these refineries are damaged and have to close, what that means is that Russia won't be able to take delivery of all of that crude oil because the refinery isn't in a position to keep refining. And that's going to cause production problems from Russia's point of view and potentially mean that Russia may need to cut back further on production, which could cause it some major problems going forward. This chart shows the movement in the price of Brent crude oil over the last 12 months. And what you can see is that partly as a result of the news that these refineries have been attacked in Russia, oil prices have risen over the last few days and are now at their highest level since the start of November 2023, so the highest for the last 4 months. And the reason that oil prices are going up is that the oil markets in terms of demand and supply are very finely balanced. Oil producers want to keep the price of oil as high as possible. And if you've been following the channel, you'll know that OPEC Plus have announced a number of oil production cutbacks over the last 12 months to try to keep prices as high as possible. And as a result of these production cutbacks, oil prices have been on the rise since the middle of December 2023. However, if we zoom in and have a look at what's been happening over the last week, there's been a pronounced increase in the price of oil as a result of these strikes. And the reason for that is that Russia is one of the world's suppliers of oil. Even though the West is no longer buying Russian oil, India and China are still buying large quantities. And if Ukraine does continue bombarding Russian oil facilities with drone attacks, which result in a continued reduction in Russia's oil production, then that will mean that the balance between supply and demand starts moving in favour of demand as demand increases, and therefore it's likely that prices could continue going up. And obviously, from a global economy point of view, that is potentially bad news, because rising oil prices will feed through into the price of everything, because most products need to be delivered and so therefore have some form of transport costs included in them. And that could mean that we start to see inflation going back up again at a time when most economies thought that they'd got control of inflation. And if inflation does start rising again, that will put pressure back onto interest rates and mean that they stay higher for longer, and therefore could have a potentially damaging impact on the global economy. And this chart shows the movement in the price of Urals crude oil, which is the main form of Russian oil. And whilst the price of Russian oil has also been on the rise in 2024, it's interesting to note that over the course of the last week, we haven't seen the same sort of spike that we've seen in Brent crude oil. And that's obviously as a result of the fact that Russian oil production is being affected. And if you've been following the channel, you'll be aware that Russia recently introduced an outright ban on the export of all gasoline products for 6 months from the 1st of March, which obviously means that there's less Russian oil going into the market. And potentially these drone attacks could mean further cutbacks and less Russian oil being available. And as a result of that, the price of Russian oil isn't moving at the same rate as the price of Brent crude oil. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think the fact that Ukraine is sticking with its plan to hit oil and gas facilities located in Russia is a really interesting topic, and also marks a sea change in the war in Ukraine. Up until now, Ukraine has been defending itself on its own land, and from Russia's point of view, that's been absolutely fine. However, now that they've developed the technology to be able to send drones deep into Russian territory, up to 800 miles so far, it's changing the perspective of what's going on, because Russia is now vulnerable to all of those attacks, because as we saw from the footage earlier, these drones are relatively small, so they're quite hard to locate and identify and to hit and intercept. And as a result of that, some of them are getting through. Not all of them, a lot of them are being shot down, but if you're sending 50 or 60 or 100 drones, that's going to be quite difficult to be able to make sure you intercept every single one of them. And all you need is one of these drones to strike the facilities to cause chaos and damage. Because as we talked about in a recent video, there is a process that's involved at these refineries. Oil moves sequentially from one area to another. So if you cause a breakdown in one of those processes, it can cause the whole facility to have to shut down. And obviously when we're talking about oil refineries, we've got a lot of flammable substances on site. So when a fire starts, it can spread very quickly and cause a lot of damage. And as we've talked about previously, Russia is currently vulnerable in terms of it's lost all of its business partners. A lot of the companies that helped develop these facilities and build them, such as BP, ExxonMobil and Shell, no longer have any dealings with Russia, so they don't have access to that expertise to be able to fix things, and also they don't have access to the technology. So if something is blown up that needs technological advancement to be able to replace it, Russia may struggle because they've got a limited supply of microchips that they stocked up on prior to the invasion of Ukraine, and those supplies are now running low and they're struggling to be able to access the latest technology. And in terms of the impact on Russia's revenue, we talked about the fact that the attacks so far have resulted in around 1 million barrels of day production being affected. So that's around $75 million at crude oil prices, but could be as high as $150 million per day if we're talking about the most expensive refined products. And when you annualize those figures, we're talking about potentially $40 or $50 billion worth of impact on the Russian economy. That is revenue that they're losing as a result of the strikes that have happened in the last few days. Now, if Ukraine continues with the offensive at the same sort of rate over the next few months, this could result in absolute chaos in the oil and gas industry in Russia. And as we talked about, Ukraine has been funding these initiatives. It set up the BRAVE1 Program to try to develop technology such as this so that it could start changing the way it's defending itself against Russia. And attacks on Russian oil and gas facilities are very effective because they have a huge financial implication on the Russian economy. Now, if you've been following the channel, you'll know that over the last 12 months, Russia has announced voluntary cutbacks of 1 million barrels per day. It says to be in line with what OPEC Plus is doing, but there are questions as to whether or not that is because Russia is struggling from a production point of view as a result of the loss of technology and expertise. And in addition to those cutbacks, we've now got another 1 million barrels per day as a result of the damage that's been caused by these drone attacks. Now, if Ukraine is successful in hitting these facilities with more drone attacks, if we see another 1 million barrels per day or maybe 2 million barrels per day being affected, that's going to have a massive impact on Russia's economy and its finances. Russia recently announced an outright ban for the next 6 months on all gasoline exports, which it said was because it needed to prioritise its consumers and its agriculture industry. So there is a potential that Russia could announce further bans. It might ban the export of all diesel and other related refined products. And if it gets to that point where it has to ban all exports, then obviously the Russian economy won't be getting any income from all of those refined products. Now, that's obviously an extreme situation, but that's what Ukraine is trying to achieve. It's trying to damage every single one of the Russian oil refineries to cause chaos in Russia's finances and potentially bring about some sort of peace negotiation, some sort of settlement. The only way that Ukraine is going to get there, I think, is by doing this sort of thing, because what's happening on the ground in Ukraine isn't working. Russia has more firepower. Ukraine is waiting for more aid and more finance and more military equipment. But in the meantime, Russia is making advances. So Ukraine has now moved its tactics to more of an economic warfare, and that's going to have the biggest impact on Russia out of everything that we've been talking about over the last 12 months. And one final thing that I wanted to mention today is obviously there is an upcoming election in Russia, the presidential election. And President Putin has said that Ukraine is trying to damage the election, that these drone attacks are a deliberate policy to try to undermine his power. And I think what he's really saying here is that this obviously isn't good PR from his point of view. Up until now, what's happening in Ukraine was a special military operation that was nothing to do with the Russian people. However, what they're now seeing is these explosions taking place at refineries that they're either working at or they're living close to. And we're seeing the video footage being posted on Russian Telegram channels. And as a result of that, it's obviously now causing concern amongst the Russian population that Ukraine is starting to attack Russia itself. And obviously, that's not good news from a PR perspective. And so President Putin is not happy. So the overall summary of today's video is that Ukraine has now changed its tactics in terms of its defense against Russia. It's gone on the offensive and is attacking Russian oil and gas facilities in Russia. That's having a huge impact on those facilities and Russia's ability to process oil. And ultimately, it will have a huge impact on Russia's revenue and Russia's economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.